The woods. Remember everything. There's something about the woods at night that strips you down to your most primal self. No matter how brave you think you are, no matter how many campfires you've sat around, no matter how many hiking trails you've walked, no matter how confidently you've pitched a tent in the dark, the moment the last light fades and the tree line swallows the sky whole, something ancient and deeply uncomfortable wakes up inside you. You start listening differently. Every crack of a branch becomes a question mark. Every rustle in the underbrush becomes a sentence you can't quite finish. Every shadow that shifts at the edge of your flashlight beam becomes a door you're not sure you want to open. I've spent years collecting stories from people who experience things they can't explain in the woods, specifically from people who went through the American Scouting program. Those weeks and months and years of campouts, merit badge hikes, and overnight wilderness trips that form some of the most vivid memories of childhood. Most of those memories are good. Some of them are not. The three accounts you're about to hear are real. The names and certain identifying details have been changed to protect the people involved, but the events themselves are exactly as they were described to me. Raw, unfiltered, and deeply unsettling. These aren't campfire ghost stories designed to make you jump. They're the kind of stories that crawl under your skin and stay there. The kind you think about years later when you're lying in bed and you hear an unfamiliar sound outside your window. If you've ever been out in the wilderness at night and felt that creeping, inexplicable certainty that something was watching you, you already know what these people are talking about. Let's begin. The thing that followed us back. My name isn't important. What matters is that I'm 23 years old. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and for the better part of my childhood and teenage years, scouting was my entire world. I didn't just dip my toes into it. I went all in. I started as a Cub Scout when I was 8 years old, a hyperactive kid with a flashlight obsession and absolutely zero fear of mud. And I worked my way up through every rank with the kind of determination that probably annoyed everyone around me. By the time I was 17, I had earned the rank of Eagle Scout, which, if you've been through the program, you know is not something that happens by accident. It takes years of commitment, service hours, leadership projects, and a near-pathological love of the outdoors. I owe a lot of who I am to that program, but I also carry something from it that I didn't ask for, a memory that lives in the back of my head, like a splinter I can't quite reach, something that surfaces every time I'm in the woods after dark, and I hear a sound I can't immediately explain. I want to tell you about that memory now. The summer before my sophomore year of high school, I was 15 years old and still running with the same troop I'd been in for years. A lot of kids had come and gone by then. Scouting has a dropout problem. Once the social pressure of middle school sets in, a lot of kids decide that campouts aren't cool anymore, that they'd rather be somewhere with Wi-Fi and air conditioning, and I don't entirely blame them. But my best friend at the time, a guy I'll call Marcus, never quit. Marcus and I had been in the same class since 4th grade, and we'd risen through the scouting ranks together, almost in lockstep. He was the kind of person who made every campout feel like an adventure, always the first one ready, always the one cracking jokes around the fire, always the person who somehow had exactly the right piece of gear for whatever situation you were in. We were inseparable. That summer, our troop headed out for a multi-day campout at a forested park somewhere in the eastern part of our state. I genuinely cannot tell you the name of the park. This was nearly 8 years ago, and the specifics have faded in the way that certain memories do when your brain decides the emotional residue is more important than the factual details. What I can tell you is that it was dense, old-growth forest, the kind where the canopy blocks out the stars, the kind where you can be 50 yards from the trail and completely invisible to anyone walking past. Our scoutmaster, a retired high school teacher named Mr. Coleman, was the kind of leader who believed in full immersion. He didn't just take us hiking. He turned every hike into a lesson: trail navigation, wildlife identification, low-impact camping. He was endlessly patient and genuinely passionate, and every kid in the troop respected him, including me. Even after what happened, we arrived at the park in the late afternoon, a convoy of minivans and pickup trucks crammed with gear and teenage boys. And Mr. Coleman led us on our initial hike out to the campsite. It took about 40 minutes through a mix of marked trail and open terrain, and by the time we'd set up our tents and eaten a quick snack, the sun was already dropping toward the tree line. That's when Mr. Coleman announced the second hike. This was standard for him. He believed that navigating in low-light conditions was a skill every scout should develop, and he liked to take us out just as the evening was transitioning to full dark, letting us use our flashlights and compasses while the forest changed around us. He'd done it on probably a dozen campouts before this one without incident. We set off in a loose group, Mr. Coleman at the front, a couple of assistant leaders at the back, the rest of us in between. The forest was cooling down as the sun disappeared, and there was that specific smell, pine and earth and something slightly damp, that I still associate with those hikes whenever I catch a whiff of it now. About 20 minutes in, Mr. Coleman pulled his classic move. There was a younger kid in our troop, couldn't have been more than 11, named Tyler, who was on his first or second campout. Mr. Coleman stopped the group and announced that Tyler was going to lead us back to camp. He handed Tyler the compass with a conspiratorial grin and told the rest of us to follow his lead. It was a game he liked to play. The older scouts knew it was coming. The younger ones always fell for it. Tyler studied the compass with the kind of intense focus that only 11-year-olds in unfamiliar situations can muster. He pointed confidently in a direction that was probably about 30 degrees off from correct, and he took 2 steps forward. And then he stopped. He turned to Mr. Coleman with enormous eyes and said, very quietly, "Did you hear that?" Mr. Coleman leaned into it the way he always did, stepping dramatically to one side and pressing his ear toward the trees in an exaggerated listening pose. Marcus and I both started laughing. It was a well-worn bit at this point. And Mr. Coleman shot us a sharp look that cut our laughter off mid-breath. Because then we all heard it. Not a branch falling. Not the wind through the canopy. Not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. A footstep. One deliberate, heavy, unmistakable footstep from somewhere in the trees to our left, followed by what sounded like a pause, and then another one. The flashlight beams scattered instantly. Every kid in the group was sweeping their light across the tree line, and the forest swallowed every beam without giving anything back. Whatever was out there, if there was anything out there, was beyond the reach of our lights. Mr. Coleman's voice shifted. Not panicked, but different. The performance was gone. "Everybody together," he said. "We're heading back now. Make noise as you walk. Clap, talk, whatever. Just make noise." He told us that making noise was the best way to deter any large predator that might be in the area. Bears, cougars, whatever the regional wildlife threw at you. It was solid advice, and he delivered it calmly. But I want to be honest. Hearing your scoutmaster invoke the phrase large predator in a forest at night, when you're 15 and your flashlight suddenly feels very small, is not a comfortable experience. We walked back. We made noise, and something followed us the entire way. I'm not being dramatic when I say that. 3 separate times during our return hike, multiple people heard footsteps from behind the group. Distinct, heavy, paced. Mr. Coleman kept moving, kept urging us forward, kept telling us to stay together and stay loud. The two assistant leaders bracketed the group from behind. Nobody panicked outright, but everyone was scared. We reached the campsite and the collective exhale was almost audible. Mr. Coleman got the fire going immediately, and within 20 minutes we were sitting in the warmth of the campfire while he launched into his story rotation, a collection of scouting lore, local legends, and dramatized wilderness tales he'd been telling for years. It was exactly the kind of reset the group needed, but the stories were cut short. About 45 minutes in, while Mr. Coleman was in the middle of something involving a creek and a missing compass, one of the younger kids stood up and pointed toward the east side of the campsite with a shaking arm. There were footsteps again, not from the distant tree line this time, from the perimeter of the camp. Circling, the older scouts stood up. The assistant leaders looked at each other with an expression I'd never seen on adults in a scouting context before, something between calculation and alarm. Then the second assistant leader, a former military man named Mr. Garrett, said, "All right, stay here." He walked directly to his tent, unzipped it, and came back carrying a rifle. I had known Mr. Garrett for 3 years. I had never seen the rifle before. He chambered a round, pointed the barrel upward at a 45-degree angle toward the trees, and fired a single shot into the sky. The sound was enormous in the forest silence. My ears rang. Every bird within half a mile exploded from the canopy, and then there was absolutely nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, no sound except the fire and our own breathing. Mr. Garrett stood with the rifle for another full minute, scanning the tree line. Then he lowered it, nodded once like he'd confirmed something, and walked back to his tent. Nobody made the obvious jokes. Nobody pretended it was funny. We sat around the fire for another 30 minutes, quieter now, and then Mr. Coleman sent us all to bed. Marcus and I were sharing a tent. We zipped it up, arranged our sleeping bags, and I think we both knew we were going to spend some time lying awake pretending not to be freaked out before eventually falling asleep. We exchanged maybe 100 words total, none of them about what had just happened, before silence settled over us. I fell asleep. I don't know how long I was out. It felt like hours, though it might have been less. When I woke up to Marcus's hand on my shoulder, not a gentle shake, a sustained, rigid grip that communicated something before he even said a word. I came fully awake in seconds. "Don't make a sound," Marcus breathed. "Listen." I listened. Footsteps, close, circling the tent. The campfire was still going. It threw a dim orange glow against the fabric walls, and in that glow, I could see shadows. The shadows you'd expect. The tent's own frame, the outline of the trees, the soft shape of the dying fire, and one shadow I did not expect. A person, upright, broad, moving slowly along the outside of the tent wall. I whispered to Marcus that it was probably one of the scoutmasters making the rounds. That was a perfectly normal thing that happened on campouts. He grabbed my wrist and shook his head with a violence that told me he had already dismissed that theory. "Look," he mouthed. He pointed to the shadow's right side, and even through the tent fabric, even with the distortion of the orange firelight, there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The figure was carrying something. Long, held low. The silhouette of it was unmistakable. A knife. I don't know how to describe what happens to your body in a moment like that. Every system switches modes simultaneously. I went from half asleep to completely, crystallinely, brutally awake in the span of a single heartbeat. My whole body went tight. Marcus was completely still beside me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have cell phones. This was the era before every 15-year-old had a smartphone in their pocket. And even if we'd had them, there was no signal out there. We couldn't call anyone. We couldn't text anyone. We couldn't do anything except sit in our sleeping bags in the dark and watch the shadow move around the outside of our tent. The figure made one full pass around our tent, then moved on to the adjacent one. We sat there for what I would estimate was 3 hours. Though time does strange things when you're running purely on adrenaline. Neither of us slept. Neither of us spoke above the barest whisper. We just waited. Eventually, the sound stopped. The shadow didn't come back. The fire burned down to coals. At some point, in the hours before dawn, we both finally lost consciousness out of sheer exhaustion. Mr. Coleman's whistle woke us at 6:30. Marcus and I looked at each other in the pale morning light, filtering through the tent walls, and had a silent, immediate agreement. We were telling the scoutmasters, right now, before breakfast, before anything. All three adults listened to us with the kind of attention that told us they weren't writing it off as a teenage nightmare. Mr. Coleman made us go through every detail twice. He asked clarifying questions. Mr. Garrett's expression in particular was not the expression of someone who thought we were exaggerating. They told the entire troop to pack up, not, let's wrap up early, not, we're going to cut the trip short. Pack. Everything. Now. Parents would be called. Someone would be there to pick everyone up within 3 hours. The troops scattered to their tents, and that's when the real discovery happened. 2 of the younger scouts, both around 11, both tent mates, came to Mr. Coleman with a confused, slightly nauseated look. Their packs were missing. Not misplaced. Not dug into the bottom of the tent. Missing. Taken. Everything they'd brought, clothing, personal items, their gear, gone. Mr. Coleman had both boys step aside and approach their tent himself. What he found, he shared with Mr. Garrett in a low voice before eventually telling the older scouts what was there. Small holes had been cut into the tent fabric, 3 of them in total, each hole roughly the size of a silver dollar. Each one positioned at a height that would allow someone standing outside to press their eye to the fabric. Looking in. The police were contacted. A report was filed. The park management was notified. In the weeks that followed, we learned that a few other incidents in similar forested parks in the region had been reported that same year. Missing items from campsites, evidence of unauthorized access to campgrounds at night. Whether they were connected to what happened to us, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is this. Someone followed our group through those woods. Someone walked around our campfire while we sat there telling stories. Someone stood outside the tents of 2 sleeping 11-year-old children and looked in through holes they had cut themselves. And someone circled my tent, in the dark, carrying a knife. I still go camping. I still love the wilderness. But I have never once, in the years since that night, been able to fall asleep in a tent during the first hour without lying there and thinking about shadows on tent walls. The boy in the river. I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not the kind of person who scares easily. I'm not someone who invents drama. And until the night I'm about to describe, I'd never seriously considered that any campout would leave me genuinely shaken. My name doesn't matter. I'm 18 now. I was 15 when this happened. My troop, a mid-sized group out of San Antonio, Texas, was part of a high-adventure program offered by a wilderness camp in the Colorado mountains. This was not your standard weekend campout. This was the real thing. Rock climbing at elevation, whitewater rafting, backcountry navigation through terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. We'd been working toward it for almost a year. We flew into Denver, drove south for about an hour, and arrived at the camp in the early afternoon. The facility was in a remote valley, surrounded by peaks on three sides, with the Arkansas River running along its eastern edge. It was one of the most stunning places I'd ever been in my life. It was also, at altitude, significantly colder than any of us from South Texas were prepared for. The first 3 days were exactly what we'd signed up for. We scrambled up rock faces with experienced guides. We capsized in Class 3 rapids and laughed about it. We sat around fires at 10,000 feet watching the Milky Way. Do things it doesn't do at lower altitudes. I was exhausted every night in the best possible way. Night 4. We had set up our tents on a flat section of riverbank. We'd be rafting the next morning, and the proximity to the water was intentional. The sound of the river at first was soothing. By 2 in the morning, after 3 nights of poor sleep in the thin mountain air, it was just noise. I was a terrible sleeper at altitude. Something about the elevation messed with my breathing rhythm, and I spent most of each night cycling between light unconsciousness and wide awakeness, always too warm, always slightly disoriented. I'd been dealing with it for 3 days, but night 4 was particularly rough. I woke up at what felt like the middle of the deepest possible night. My watch said 3:42 a.m. My sleeping bag was soaked through with sweat. My face had been against the tent floor for long enough to leave an impression on my cheek. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I lay there for about 5 minutes, willing myself back to sleep, before accepting that it wasn't going to happen. I needed air. I needed to stand upright and breathe, and let my body temperature drop back to something human. I pulled on a shirt and shorts, unzipped my tent as quietly as I could, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit me immediately. Not harsh, but clean. The specific cold of mountain elevation, dry and still and utterly unlike the muggy Texas air I was accustomed to. The sky above the valley was ridiculous with stars. The river beside our campsite was running loud and fast in the dark. I stood there for a moment, just breathing. That's when I noticed him. About 25 yards from the riverbank, standing in the middle of the current, was a figure. Chest deep in water that I knew from our safety briefing earlier that day was running between 30 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, standing completely still, facing downstream, shirtless. I stood there on the bank for what was probably 30 seconds before my brain fully processed what I was looking at. A person, standing in a freezing mountain river at 3:45 in the morning, not moving, staring downstream, wearing no shirt and, from what I could see, no cold weather gear of any kind. My first thought was that this was someone from outside our group, a hiker, a local, someone I had no context for. My second thought was that whoever this was would be dead of hypothermia within the next 20 minutes if they stayed where they were. I called out. No response. I called out again, louder. Said hey. Said hello. Said hey man, is everything okay? All the things you say when you need to reach someone without panicking them. Nothing. On my third attempt, something shifted. The figure moved. He turned his head toward the bank, slowly like someone waking up from a very deep dream, and looked directly at me. In the moonlight and the faint glow from the dying campfire, I could see his face. I knew him. It was my troopmate. A guy from San Antonio I'll call Derek. One of the most grounded, sensible, physically capable people in our whole group. Derek was the kind of person who remembered to pack extra water and reminded everyone else about sunscreen. Derek was not the kind of person you expected to find standing chest deep in a freezing river at 4 in the morning, looking like he wasn't sure what planet he was on. He looked at me. He looked around, at the water, at the sky, at the bank, at me again, with a slow blinking confusion that reminded me of someone waking up from anesthesia. And then, like a switch had been thrown, he snapped into awareness. "What the—" His voice was loud, raw, frightened. He moved through the water toward the bank as fast as the current and the waist-deep pull of it would allow, which was not fast. By the time he reached the shore, his legs were visibly shaking, his skin had gone bluish-white in the moonlight, and his jaw was clenched against the cold in a way that looked almost mechanical. I grabbed the emergency blanket from the first aid kit just inside my tent and wrapped it around him. I had a dry fleece he could borrow. I made him sit down. I asked him what he was doing out there. He looked at me with an expression that I have turned over in my mind many times since that night. He said he didn't know. He said the last thing he remembered was closing his eyes in his sleeping bag. The next thing he remembered was me yelling at him from the bank. He had not, in the years I'd known him through scouting, ever sleepwalked. He'd never had any sleep disorder that anyone knew about. He didn't drink, didn't take any medication that could cause that kind of episode. As far as anyone knew, he was a perfectly healthy 15-year-old with a normal relationship with sleeping. He had just somehow walked out of his tent in the middle of the night, crossed 25 yards of rocky riverbank, and waded chest-deep into a freezing mountain river. And he had been standing there long enough to lose the ability to feel his legs. The other scouts didn't believe us in the morning. I understood why. It sounds insane. Derek himself seemed unsure whether it had really happened the way I described it, or whether there was some rational explanation we were both missing. We went through the possible explanations. Sleepwalking? He'd never done it. A medical episode? He felt fine and had no history. Something he'd eaten. Everyone ate the same things. Nothing fit. What I keep coming back to is the timing. If I hadn't woken up at 3:42 a.m., not 3:20, not 4:15, if I hadn't been someone who slept badly at altitude, if I hadn't stepped out of my tent for air at precisely that moment, Derek would have been standing in that river for another 2+ hours, in 30-degree water, at 10,000 feet of elevation, in the dark. I don't know whether he would have woken up on his own. I don't know if something else would have eventually drawn him back to shore. What I know is the temperature of that water and the altitude, and how long you can survive in those conditions without moving, without warmth, without someone to pull you out. Not long. I never told anyone other than the other scouts on that trip. I'm telling you now because I still think about it, specifically on cold nights, specifically when I hear running water, specifically when I'm in a tent and I can't sleep, and I find myself listening to the sounds outside with that particular kind of attention that means you already suspect something isn't right. Derek is fine. He's in college now, studying engineering as far as I know. He still doesn't know how he got in that river. The voice on the radio. I'll keep this short because it doesn't need length to be horrifying. I was 13 years old, living in rural Ohio. And by most definitions, I was a quiet kid. Not painfully shy. I could hold a conversation. I had friends. I wasn't the kind of person who disappeared into the background entirely. But in the context of my scout troop, I never quite found my footing socially. The other kids had their own dynamic, their own jokes and references and in-group language, and I always felt slightly adjacent to it rather than inside it. I never figured out why. Sometimes it just works that way. I'd been in the troop for almost 2 years by the time of this particular campout, and by then I had accepted my position as the kid who walked at the back of the group and kept his own company. It wasn't lonely exactly. It was just quiet. And in retrospect, Being the quiet kid who paid close attention to everything happening around him meant that I noticed things that other people missed, including on the last night of my final scouting campout, a walkie-talkie that didn't belong to me sitting inside my bag. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This campout was in October, the last one of the season. There was a chill in the air that made the hikes feel crisp and honest, the kind of cold that doesn't make you miserable so much as it makes you feel alive in a way that summer heat never quite manages. The leaves were turning in the hardwood forests around our site, oranges and deep reds that made the whole landscape look like it was lit from inside. I remember thinking at some point on the first afternoon that it was probably the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I also remember thinking at some point during one of the afternoon hikes that something was wrong. I was trailing behind the group, as I usually did, when the urge to pee became undeniable. I let the group move ahead until they were just out of sight around a bend in the trail, stepped off the path, and found a tree. It was while I was standing behind that tree that I heard it. Not a branch snapping, not the rustle of a small animal. A footstep. One single, deliberate, heavy footstep, maybe 15 feet to my right in the dead leaves. I stood completely still. Another one. Something large was moving through the undergrowth parallel to the trail, maybe 12 to 15 feet off the path, moving slowly. Each footstep distinct, weighted, intentional, not the scatter pattern of a startled deer, not the quick scurry of anything small. This was measured movement, the kind that implies awareness. I did not wait to see what it was. I caught up to the group in about 45 seconds of flat-out running and fell back into formation like nothing had happened. I told myself it was a deer. I told myself it was probably just a large dog that had wandered off from some nearby property. I spent the rest of that hike talking myself down from the edge of something I couldn't quite name. By that evening, I had mostly convinced myself I'd overreacted. I was a kid who camped alone in my tent. The troop was small enough that there weren't always enough kids to pair up, and I had my own tent. And I always tried to fall asleep early on campouts because I genuinely enjoyed the specific exhaustion of a full day of hiking. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 9, listened to the muffled sounds of the other scouts winding down, and let my eyes close. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Breathing. Not outside the tent. Not from a neighboring tent. From inside my bag. From somewhere in the pile of gear I'd pushed to one side when I lay down. I sat up. I dug through my stuff. Flashlight, extra socks, a paperback I'd been reading, the usual chaos of a 13-year-old's packing job, until my hands closed around something hard and heavy and unfamiliar. A walkie-talkie. Not mine. I hadn't brought a walkie-talkie. We used troop-issued ones on some hikes, but we always returned them to the scoutmaster's kit at the end of the day. This was not a troop walkie-talkie. This was something different. Older looking, worn, heavier than the ones I was used to. I stared at it in the beam of my flashlight for about 5 seconds. Then, from the speaker, in a voice that was low and muffled, and absolutely definitively not a kid's voice, it said, "I'm watching you, kid. I want to be careful here because I've told this story to enough people to know that there are 2 automatic responses. The disbelief response and the over-explanation response. I've heard both. I understand both. I was 13 and alone in a tent in the middle of the woods at 10 o'clock at night, and a device that wasn't mine emitted a voice that I had never heard before, a voice that was adult, deliberate, and calm, and it told me it was watching me. I pressed the transmit button. My voice came out barely functional. I said, "Who is this?" Static. Then, "Is this Mike?" Silence. Then the voice again, and this time, I felt it somewhere deep in my chest, the specific, nauseating frequency of something that is unmistakably, irreversibly real. I'm right outside your tent. The fabric on my left side depressed inward, not the gentle push of wind, not the tent settling. Something solid pressing against the outside wall of my tent from about knee height, dragging slowly upward, like a hand running along the surface. I screamed. I screamed the way a 13-year-old screams when their body has completely bypassed the rational mind and gone straight to pure biological alarm, which is to say, I screamed as loud as a human being can scream. And immediately, from outside the tent, there was the crashing sound of something moving fast through the undergrowth, away from the camp, into the woods, loud and graceless, and panicked. 2 scoutmasters arrived at my tent within seconds. I was sitting in the middle of my sleeping bag with my knees against my chest and my flashlight pointed at the tent door, and I could barely get words out in the right order. I held up the walkie-talkie. I handed it to the first scoutmaster through the open zipper. They spent several minutes going through the troop, asking who had been messing around with radio equipment, leaning hard on the known troublemakers with the practiced skepticism of adults who assumed they already knew what had happened. Nobody confessed. And when I finally steadied myself enough to rejoin the conversation, I told them what I'd already told myself in the first minute after it happened. The voice on that walkie-talkie was not a kid. It wasn't the right pitch. It wasn't the right quality. It wasn't the kind of thing any of the boys in our troop, even the oldest ones, the 16-year-olds with their half-broken baritones, could have produced. That was a grown man's voice. The scoutmasters didn't push back. That night, they reorganized every tent. Nobody slept alone. The troop was paired up across every remaining tent, and the scoutmasters sat in shifts outside by the fire with flashlights. The next morning, we packed up and relocated to a different campsite about 4 miles away, where another troop was already established and there were other adults around. I don't know what happened to the walkie-talkie. I assume the scoutmasters kept it, or turned it in somewhere, or it got lost in the shuffle of a very stressful relocation. I never saw it again. What I know is that I went home 3 days later and told my parents what had happened. Not everything. I was 13 and still processing, and I didn't want to deal with their particular brand of concerned disbelief. But enough. I told them the voice in the tent scared me. I told them I didn't want to go back. They let me quit. I never went on another scouting campout. It has been the single most frightening experience of my life. Not because of the adrenaline, not because of how loud I screamed, not because of the look on the scoutmaster's face when I handed him a walkie-talkie that didn't belong to anyone in our troop. Because of what happened the next morning, when one of the older scouts found something about 15 feet from where my tent had been pitched the night before. A clear sightline to where my tent door faced. And in the dirt, leading away from that spot and into the tree line, footprints. Large ones, adult ones, pointing away. What the darkness teaches. Every person who told me these stories carries them differently. The young man from the Pacific Northwest still goes camping. He said that stopping would feel like letting something win, and he's not willing to do that. But he checks his tent perimeter before he zips up every single night, and he always makes sure his flashlight is within arm's reach. The scout from San Antonio said he and Derek never really talked about what happened by the river. Not in any serious way, not in the years after. There's a kind of agreement between people who share an experience that can't be fully explained. Sometimes you just let it sit there, unnamed and unresolved, like a room in a house you've decided not to enter. The quiet kid from Ohio said he sometimes wonders what would have happened if he hadn't screamed. Whether whoever was outside would have eventually gotten in or eventually left. or whether the night would have ended differently in some way he doesn't want to picture. He doesn't finish that thought out loud. Neither will I. What I will say is this: the wilderness is real. The darkness is real. Most of what moves through it at night is harmless. Animals doing animal things. The ordinary mechanics of a world that existed long before we started building tents and campfires in the middle of it. But not always. Sometimes the thing that follows you back is not a bear. Sometimes the person standing in your campfire's light is not a fellow scout. Sometimes the voice in the dark is not a prank. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and something you don't want to think about is one good scream, one accidental insomnia, one friend who decides to nudge you awake at exactly the right moment. Go outside, explore, build fires, learn the stars, but listen to the woods. They remember everything that has ever happened in them. And so, sometimes, does the darkness between the trees.